The guests were gathered in the grand drawing room of Thornfield Manor, a sprawling estate belonging to the illustrious Lord Harold Thorne. The occasion was his 60th birthday, and the air was thick with polite conversation and the clinking of champagne glasses. The room was adorned with elegant tapestries, crystal chandeliers, and a roaring fire in the grand fireplace. At precisely 8 p.m., the festivities took a dark turn. Lady Beatrice, Lord Thorne's wife, screamed as she discovered Lord Thorne slumped in his armchair, lifeless. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to the motionless figure. A quick inspection revealed a small, puncture wound on his neck, a clear sign of foul play. Detective Inspector Albert Hastings, a stout man with a keen eye for detail, was summoned from the nearby village. He arrived promptly, surveying the room with a practiced gaze. "No one leaves," he declared. "We have a murderer among us." The guests were a varied lot: Lady Beatrice, a woman of grace and poise; Sir Reginald, a longtime friend of the family with a penchant for gambling; Miss Clara, Lord Thorne's young and vivacious niece; Dr. Rupert, the family physician; and Mr. Jameson, the shrewd butler who had served the family for decades. Inspector Hastings began his inquiries, starting with Lady Beatrice. "Did your husband have any enemies, my lady?" Lady Beatrice, her face pale with shock, replied, "Harold was a kind man, but his business dealings could be ruthless. Many might have wished him ill." Sir Reginald, looking uneasy, added, "Harold and I had our disagreements, but nothing serious enough to warrant this." Miss Clara, her eyes wide with fear, spoke next. "Uncle Harold was always kind to me. I can't imagine anyone wanting to harm him." Dr. Rupert, a composed figure, suggested the wound on his neck could indicate poison, perhaps administered through a needle. It would require medical knowledge. The butler, Mr. Jameson, stood silently, his expression unreadable. "I was in the kitchen preparing for the next course. I heard nothing unusual." Inspector Hastings pondered the statements, his mind piecing together the puzzle. He then examined the body more closely and found a small vial hidden in Lord Thorne's jacket pocket. The label read morphine, a potent drug. Turning to Dr. Rupert, Hastings inquired, "Would you have access to morphine, doctor?" Dr. Rupert hesitated. "Yes, but I assure you, I had no reason to harm Lord Thorne." Inspector Hastings considered this, then asked Mr. Jameson, who else could access the Manor's medicine cabinet. Mr. Jameson replied, "Only myself and Dr. Rupert, sir." Hastings' eyes narrowed. "And where were you at the time of the murder, Mr. Jameson?" "I was in the kitchen, as I said." "Preparing the meal," the butler repeated calmly. The inspector then turned to Miss Clara. "Did you see anyone enter or leave the drawing room?" Miss Clara shook her head. "No, Inspector. I was in the garden, admiring the flowers. I only came in when I heard Aunt Beatrice scream." Inspector Hastings looked at each of them in turn, his sharp mind racing through the possibilities. "Lady Beatrice, what can you tell me about your husband's business dealings?" Lady Beatrice replied, "He was involved in a variety of ventures, some more dangerous than others. He recently came into conflict with a rival over a lucrative deal." Inspector Hastings nodded, then addressed the room. "I believe I have the answer. The murderer is someone who had access to the morphine, who could administer it without raising suspicion, and who had a motive." He turned to Dr. Rupert. "Doctor, you mentioned that the wound could indicate poison administered through a needle, a method requiring medical knowledge. You had access to the morphine and the opportunity. You knew Lord Thorne's business dealings and his enemies." Dr. Rupert's face turned ashen. I only wanted to protect him from his own recklessness." His enemies were closing in. It was an act of mercy. Inspector Hastings nodded solemnly. Murder is never an act of mercy, Doctor. You are under arrest. As Dr. Rupert was led away, the remaining guests stood in stunned silence. The storm had passed, but the shock of betrayal lingered like a stench in the air.